good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. First of all, I'd like to applaud Dr. Mwango and Dr. Nell for illuminating talks. I'm also very pleased to see the number of participants that this talk has attracted. Jeremy and Dr. Mwango, there have been a number of questions in the chat group. I don't know if you've been following, but I think the first two questions were for you, Jeremy. There is a question around the agree to approach to guidelines and whether this system is used in South Africa, and another question on the EBL app. Would you like to respond to those two questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. So, yeah, a very good question about the agree criteria. So the agree criteria are publicly available criteria by which to judge guidelines, and they really aim to help both clinicians and governmental organizations and non-NGOs as well to really assess the rigor of the guidelines process. So we definitely do subscribe to those principles. It's in practice, it's a work in progress. In other words, some of the older guidelines were far less compliance, probably not the right word, but in agreement at least with the agree criteria. But it's something which I think all guidelines can work towards. And obviously, you know, it may not be possible to achieve every one of those criteria that are listed, but it's a way of making guidelines as good and objective as they can be. So it's certainly something we recommend, and which we are working towards. We'll be honest and say that it's still there's still progress that we need to make. And then I think the other question was about the EDL apps. May need a more instant way to update the guidelines regularly. Yeah, so it's a really good point, and I think it's a key aspect of updating guidelines quickly, is that just having the platform to update them easily, like for example an app or a website, doesn't of course at all guarantee that they are updated rapidly. And we've noticed that certainly in the public sector in South Africa, that the guidance on the apps, which are available, you know, pretty much to every healthcare practitioner, are not updated quickly, and that's an enormous thing that we need to get better at and improve a lot, because you're only halfway there if you have the platform to update it, but if you're not updating it quickly, you might as well have the paper. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks for those considered response. Clearly, you've given some thought to this. Dr. Mwango, Caesar Magumba in the chat group has asked a question which I think touches on sustainability. And both of you are on guidelines committee, but Albert, imagine a situation where the ministry has just procured and has a pipeline of products, and then the guidelines change, and then those products are in the pipeline kind of out of date, and then you're talking about sustainability. Can you share experience with this and any thoughts related to managing this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. And to Caesar, I think that's a very important question, and I'm glad that's the first question we are beginning to tackle. What has always been a question about sustainability is not looking at sustainability over a long period, but rather looking at how you can achieve certain immediate objectives. So at any time, as I was working with different stakeholders in the Ministry of Health, when we're looking at sustainability, we always used to ask ourselves, can we sustain this for at least this year and the year that is to come? And largely really focusing on the immediate, because that's what needs to be delivered. And if you can deliver on the short-term goals, you ultimately get solutions as you go along, as you learn more. But yes, if the question is you have this pipeline which has just come in, and then there's already something that is on your shelves, you need to have a well-coordinated phase in, phase out of these products. And that's one of the things that we've always tried not to avoid. We don't want to waste any product. I think, for instance, when we were phasing in dolutegravir, we had to look at the efavirenz, and we asked ourselves, is it really giving us the results that we want? And yes, it was. So we needed that product. It's not like we had to drop it like a hot potato. So we needed to continue using it. People knew we're comfortable with it. Patients were comfortable with it. That was the most important thing. Dolutegravir was coming on the scene, and it was bringing other benefits. So we also wanted those other benefits. So really, we had to handle it in such a way that you had both products running, but they're not competing with each other. You have new patients taking on dolutegravir. The old patients who are already used to efavirenz were taking it, and as it's phasing, it's running down, it's being phased out. You are moving people now to the new regimens that will continue with their treatment without losing any gains. So really, it's a very delicate balance of issues, and very sensitive to cost, of course. But ultimately, we all know that these goods these products, they come in for the good of our people. And that's what we need to keep in mind. If we can achieve keeping all the patients that are coming in and those that are already on treatment for the whole year without any disruption, then we're doing well. That is the immediate sustainability goal that I've always embraced as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Albert, for a comprehensive sharing of your experience. Before I invite Jeremy to share the South African experience, I just thought I would also share some experience here in Uganda that uses the very same example of shifting to dolutegravir with a lot of efavirenz in the pipeline. And, you know, when we switched many of our friends to dolutegravir, especially those who had been on efavirenz for a long time, you know, they appreciated this. You know, there was a kind of a lift of their, you know, neurocognitive function and all of this. But then a few months later, at least at our Center of Excellence at the National Referral Hospital, we started to see some hyperglycemia cases among those who, especially those who had been on stavudine for a long time. So I'm only highlighting this, that, you know, you change guidelines, you see benefits, then in a certain subsection, you see some setbacks. So it's a very interesting dynamic. Jeremy, what's been your experience in South Africa before we move to the next question?
Yeah, very much the same. And thanks, Albert. I mean, that's a really good summary of the problems with the transition between efavirenz and dolutegravir. And as you rightly said, I think that, you know, one of the key reasons to assess is why you're making the switch. You know, is there some new toxicity you really want to run away from? Or really, in the case of efavirenz to dolutegravir, it wasn't. And it was, as you said, it's a drug that we've known and had really good success with for many years. And there isn't a good reason to bin that drug, which is still viable at considerable cost, when you're making a much more gentle transition. So very much like I'm sure was the case where you were, you know, it was a case where in fact the new patients got dolutegravir first, and the ones who are already on efavirenz transitioned and are still transitioning towards dolutegravir-based regimens at a much more sort of leisurely pace, but at a pace that really sustains the drug's availability, and you don't get any sudden shocks to the system, which will be far worse. You know, if you move everyone to dolutegravir-based regimens over 1 month and then run out of that drug, you know, you had a far worse outcome than if you did it in a more gradual way. But I think, you know, the reason is that we were happy with that drug and the incremental yield was quite small. Whereas in other settings, it may be that the drug you're moving away from has a really big problem, in which case you have to move quicker. But that's a lot harder. Thanks.
I can't agree more. There's one more question in the chat group, and I think it's targeted to you, Jeremy. It's a question about how you update guidelines without losing the benefit that was in the previous version. And I think you hinted on it, in that when you issue new guidelines, you highlight the new changes. But I don't know if you want to address the question further. There's also a follow-up question on how relevant are apps in our resource-limited settings. I think that's the essence of the question.
Yeah, so the apps one is hard because it's a double-edged sword. And like we said, you know, one is that you always need internet connectivity if you want to update it, but some apps can download, you know, when you have internet connectivity and you're able to use them when you don't. The one big problem with apps in general, though, with the guidelines is that they really are quite vulnerable to the latest updates of the phone software. So if you have an Android phone or an iPhone or something and you're updating to the latest version, often that breaks the app. And we've seen that with the EDL guidelines we have for the state sector here in South Africa, that on my phone it works for the first month, and then as the new iOS version comes through, it doesn't work for the next. So it's quite a double-edged sword. Another option, it's definitely got advantages. Another option is a sort of living document online, which you could go to, which like a web page, which is much easier to update. And it's much harder to break, but it does require then internet full time, which is something that app doesn't. And in terms of not losing the benefits of the previous version of guidelines, it's a very hard thing to balance. I think what we've tried and do is have continuity between the people who wrote the guidelines in the previous versions and the newer ones to make sure that we always add some people and subtract some people so that you've got a core group which goes through. That's just one strategy, but it's very hard. And I think one other thing we are trying as well is to really sort of test this, really show some people who are junior clinicians the app and the guidelines and say, what do you think? What is it missing? What's not good? What can we improve?
Thank you. That's a really great experience you've shared. So we have 2 or 3 minutes before we go to the final remarks. I have a question for both of you. As I'm personally an enthusiast for the application of data science to health, and looking at the deluge of papers that Jeremy highlighted in his talk, I see a real possibility for artificial intelligence, which you touched on. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts, because I think artificial intelligence is powerful. It's trainable with things like deep learning. Do you think this is where we're headed? That it will be too much, that if we write the right software and code that is even trainable, we could get there? Any thoughts?
Perhaps I'll just jump in for the first bit and then I'll hand it over to Albert. So I think that it is definitely a way of the future as the number of papers published each month increase. I do think, though, it's got a long way to go at the moment. I think that the experience with the COVID-19 was that, to be honest, it wasn't all that helpful at the moment. And it's not an intrinsic limitation. I think it's just because this is new with AI. Yeah. And I think with time, AI will get better and better at it, and also perhaps be more customizable to individual users. And I think that it's definitely got a role to play in the future, although I don't know that we're there quite yet. I don't know what your thoughts were, Albert.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I think we're a long ways off to relying on this new technology, absolutely. But I think it's a good idea for us to start delving into it and trying to use it for even limited areas of speciality, just so that we can see how these results are coming out, and we refine on that technology by having an interaction between the traditional approaches where we've used experts and we've used committees like the GRADE, and then combining that to get the ultimate, refined guidelines, which are developed with all the information that is coming out very quickly. Because I think it's a very delicate decision to decide which evidence makes an important contribution to the final guidelines. And that's something that committees that are working on guidelines have always had to struggle with, the amount of data that is there. So we really have to find any way that can make things easier, and definitely using AI is something that we should be considering, even though it is in the early stages, but it's something that should grow and help us really do a good job of what we need to do to get good guidelines. Thank you.
Well, colleagues, thank you very much both for illuminating talks as well as the responses. I have to congratulate you, because just looking at the people who have signed up for the talk as well as the session and the chat group, I think you've interested the audience quite a bit. What remains for me is to say that I hope the people listening in see the challenge ahead. We are generating a lot of evidence at a rate where we really need to be innovative on how we can synthesize the evidence for the benefit of our communities. So please join me in profusely thanking Dr. Nell and Dr. Mwango for this illuminating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.